This isn't really near Arcata, but it's on the way, and the story just came to me a minute ago. I grew up in a small town in Maine near Bowdoin College, and about 2 years ago, I was dating a guy from Bowdoin, the town, not the college, who graduated from the same high school as I did. He was a couple years older than I, and had spent a few years in the army, traveling to such exotic places as Korea. I've traveled a few places myself, and being open to new places and experiences, never thought of myself as shy or easily frightened by much of anything. One evening, the man I was seeing, Tim, and I decided we would head out into the woods to one of the numerous secluded areas in Bowdoin, where we could spend some quality time, doing such things as talking and other nonsense that lovers do. This particular night, we had driven up to an old quarry, and it was overcast, so that when the truck was parked and the lights were turned off, the world around us was inky black. I had trouble making out the trees that I knew were just beyond the window of the truck. Nights that dark always make one a little weary, and there is something almost natural and primal about being in the woods so deep you cannot see nor hear anything but silence. Like I said, I'm not shy, and on this night, I was feeling adventurous, and I wanted to get out of the truck. So, out of the truck I went and into the bed of the truck. Tim followed suit. We laid there on a blanket for a long while when we heard a loud thump on the hood of the truck. I thought a branch had fallen onto the hood, but it was enough to startle us both into getting a flashlight from the inside of the truck. We looked on the hood, nothing. We looked around the truck, nothing but normal leaves and trail. No branches large enough to make the sound we heard. The flashlight was one of those halogen beams that is about 10 times brighter than a normal flashlight, but the darkness was eating up all the light, with the exception of the beam from the bulb. Usually, there's a wide area those lights will cover. This time, however, the light seemed to be overwhelmed by the darkness around us. Feeling a bit on edge, I decided to get back into the truck, but didn't want to leave the woods. As we sat there talking, we got more and more comfortable, and then something slammed into the side of the truck, hard enough to make it rock on the shocks. To me, it sounded and felt like it hit my side, just behind the door. I felt suddenly uneasy. I thought at first that a tree had fallen on us. Tim turned on the truck lights and got out of the truck to look around. I stayed in the truck and watched as he walked around the truck, looking at the ground and at the side of the truck. He signaled for me to get out. I did so. Where I thought the tree had fallen, there was a mudgy smudge on the side of his truck, but not tree, nothing on the ground or around us that would have caused what we just experienced. He asked if I wanted to go, and at that time, I felt so strongly like we should leave, but my curiosity was getting the better of me, and I wanted to stay and see what would happen next. We got back in the truck and sat there, anticipating. Tim turned off all the lights and cracked some jokes about privacy in the deep woods. The longer we sat there, the more uneasy I got, till I felt like I was nearly terrified for no reason. I wanted to leave. Tim, obviously feeling the same way, started the truck, and we sped out of the woods at tire-blowing speeds till we saw the lights of the houses. We went into Brunswick and got out to look at the truck again, and where that smudge had been before, now the truck was untouched, like nothing had happened. We never saw what hit the truck or experienced anything like that again. Nothing else unusual happened when we were together, with the exception of one other time when we were at his mother's house, but that's another story. Thank you for reading. I took down my memories from an incident about 8 years ago. Definitely a true story. The other girls that I was with at the time may have not put as much stake in the paranormal, but parts of this experience were too odd to be all coincidental. I hope you enjoy. While this experience happened a number of years ago, and has not had any direct bearing on my life, I find it interesting nevertheless. I grew up mostly in Western Connecticut, and though my family moved around a lot in my teens, I attended summer camp every year in Cornwall, Connecticut. In total, I attended or worked at the camp for 8 summers, and in the last 3 years I worked there. During the 6th summer, I was 15 or 16 at the time. I had a strange experience with the other girls I was a CIT with. By the way, It means counselor in training. And while we were hiking outside at night, what made you think that was a good idea, you might ask? But rest assured, there was a good reason. One class held every week culminated in an overnight camping trip, and one of our friends was supervising the overnight. We decided that since she was going to be sitting out alone in the middle of the woods, making sure all the girls actually went to bed, she might benefit from some company, and about 5 or 6 of us headed out with flashlights to find the campsite. Just to clarify, this camp is by no means large. It sits on one side of a commercial ski mountain on a large lake. The campsite our friend was at was alongside a wooded path at the far side of the camp's boundaries, a lovely walk during the day. But a couple of my friends were really timid and nervous about walking around at night, even though we all had attended the camp for years, and years obviously grown used to being in the dark alone. It wasn't a frightening place, other than the darkness and raccoons. We started out on our walk between 9:30 and 10 p.m., followed the wooded path out to a wide gravel road that led to another boat launch site, and remembered that our friend had told us not to go towards the lake, off to the right. The site wasn't far off from that turnoff. None of us had actually ever been to the site itself, and were a little on edge as we started walking away from the water, up the wide, gravel-covered road, because there were lots of animal noises around us, and it was dark, like the deep woods gets at night in summertime. There really was no reason for any of us to actually feel afraid, because the wildlife was more or less accustomed to people and stayed scarce when people were around. Also, we were on a road, not lost in the middle of the woods. We kept walking for what seemed like a relatively short time, but didn't see any sign of a campsite. When someone would suggest we turn back, another person would suggest that we walk just a little further, and I remember feeling inclined to keep walking, because the campsite might just be a little further up the road. We had started walking uphill significantly, and eventually, someone gave an ultimatum, saying we'd be out for more than an hour, walking, and she was scared to walk any further. I was skeptical, even though I too had begun to feel somewhat uneasy. We turned around. I had an odd feeling though the whole walk back that I shouldn't turn around, which probably spooked me more than anything else. We nearly missed our turn back to camp, and when we made it back to the camp center, we found the camp director and several maintenance workers looking panic-stricken. They told us it was past midnight, and our friend, who had been out on the overnight, had brought her campers back less than an hour earlier when she found out there was going to be a powerful thunderstorm hitting. She hadn't known where we were, knew we had planned to come visit her, and went straight to the director so we could be found. We explained what happened, how we couldn't find the campsite, how we kept walking, hadn't any inclination that we'd been out for as long as we had, and our friend looked confused. It wasn't possible, she explained, that we couldn't have seen her campsite. They had camped at a small site, right off of the little wooded path we'd first walked down, and had built up a large fire that was easily visible from the path for some ways in either direction. We shrugged it off as just a strange experience, but when you add everything up, the explanation that we just missed seeing you, kept going, turned off, and walked up a gravel road for a couple miles never sit quite right with me. I didn't learn the strangest part of the story until a couple of years ago. There's a small town located within an uninhabited portion of Cornwall in Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut, called either Dudleytown or Dudleyville, depending on the account. The ghost town, so to speak, is called one of the most haunted places in the country, with a long history of inhabitant mental illness, disappearances, murder, ghost sightings, etc. Some of the most poignant stories of the strange going-ons of Dudleytown have been recently documented spirit sightings, orbs, mechanical failure, cold spots, and the most startling discovery for me was the knowledge that Dudleytown was just located a few miles away from my camp, and, according to my map's readings, further along up the road we had walked on that night and down another turnoff. I've wondered why was it that we kept on walking that night, even though a couple of people were very scared, why I felt like we should just keep walking, why we missed seeing that plainly visible fire, why I felt I couldn't turn back and look behind me, and if we just continued walking along that road, what would have happened if the storm had hit while we were out? Thanks for reading. This happened 2 years ago in Hilton Head, South Carolina. My cousins and myself go on vacation every year. My cousin Daniel and I are best friends and usually stay together all the time. We got to share a room that year. My parents and my aunt and uncle had rented a house on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina that summer for a 2-week vacation. The house was huge, with more rooms on the main floor than my house has on all of the floors. My cousin Daniel and I ran through the house and picked out the coolest room in the house. The room was strange, I must admit. The far corners were made of glass, so you could see into the woods out back. I settled into my room immediately, so my other cousins couldn't take the room. My cousin Daniel left the room to get his bags, just as I finished. It had been a long day, and it was getting dark. I laid down on the bed I chose, and before I knew what happened, I fell asleep. I awoke from my sleep at exactly 3:20 in the morning because my cousin, being a chunky person, turned up the air conditioning in the room. So, instead of waking him up by turning down the air and hearing him complain all night, I decided to find somewhere else to sleep only for the night. I wandered the house until I made my way outside in the back of the house. The back of the house had a deck that was in disrepair. I got many splinters in my feet from shuffling outside. The back of the house, after the deck, makes its way into deep woods. However, there was a hammock on the deck that I found comfortable enough to sleep in. I was soon torn from my sleep by a bright light in the woods. I was shocked at first, but when my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw a bright boy emerging from the woods. The boy was 20 feet away at first, but I blinked, and he was less than 5 feet away. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a huge scar running from his right ear to his lips. I was so scared that I tried to jump from my hammock, but fell out instead, scraping my face on the deck. I woke up the next morning in my bed. I thought it was all a dream, but when I looked in the mirror and saw the scratches from the deck on my face, I never went in the back of the house again. Thanks for reading. There have been some stories here recently about roads that appeared or disappeared or led to strange places or turned into something that was unexpected. This story is about how we almost lost some people on a trail that ended in a meadow that could not possibly have been there. I was not there when this supposedly happened, so I cannot guarantee its truth. Later investigation showed absolutely nothing. That happened long ago, and I do not necessarily remember all of the details now, but at least I think that I have the story pretty much right. In a remote mountain camp that I used to frequent, a trail led down the river a short distance, I think about a mile or so, to Rotary Gospel Camp. Both our camp and the Rotary Gospel Camp, and the river between them, were in a narrow canyon with high ridges on both sides and no side canyons. Several of us had been down that canyon, also up and over the ridges on both sides, and we knew that there was no way to leave that canyon without knowing it. Although the terrain was steep, hiking was easy along the trail, and that route was considered quite safe for youth day hikes. Generally, it is hard to become lost when following a river downstream, but when following a river upstream, in some cases, there is a possibility of becoming lost by accidentally following a tributary rather than the main stream. In this case though, in that deep narrow canyon, all that they had to do was hike back up the canyon to our camp, and in an emergency, they could have gone into the Rotary Gospel Camp and used their telephone, so we considered it a safe hike. One afternoon, 2 adults from our camp, with several youth members ranging in age from maybe 11 years to about 15 years, hiked down the trail towards the Rotary Gospel Camp, intending to turn back at the edge of that camp and return to our camp well before dinner. The adults and some of the youth members knew the trail well. In that narrow canyon, over the short distance to the Rotary Gospel Camp, and with several people who knew the trail, a map and compass seemed unnecessary. Several people had wristwatches, the mechanical, wind-up kind. Modern quartz crystal watches were non-existent in those days. One person had a pen light, and one youth member had a camera. This is their story as I remember it. Some distance down the trail, when they expected soon to reach the Rotary Gospel Camp, The canyon widened into a huge meadow that nobody recognized. Nearby, at one edge of the meadow, beside the trees, there was a log cabin, but no people were visible. The meadow seemed much too wide to fit in that narrow canyon. There was no possibility that the group had passed the Rotary Gospel Camp, as it was in the bottom of the canyon, just like our own camp. Although they knew that something was wrong, they followed the river into the meadow, alert for any tributary streams that might confuse them when they retracted their route. After a while, they noticed that the river had decreased greatly in size and flow. That alarmed them, and they turned around and headed back up the river. Even as they followed the river upstream in the meadow, the river rapidly disappeared. There were no dams on that river, and no recent weather patterns to account for such a sudden decrease in the flow. They followed the sandy river channel back upstream through the meadow, but soon, even the channel disappeared, leaving the group in that big flat meadow with only the mountain ridges for landmarks, and even those ridges seemed to be too much far apart. From the group's position within the meadow, they could not even see the canyon where the river had entered the meadow. Since they did not have a compass, one of the adults used the sun as an indicator of azimuth to keep them headed back towards our camp. But as they took frequent note of the sun's position, they noticed that it was setting much too fast, even though their watches indicated that the time still was early afternoon. At that time of the year, the middle of June, at that location, the sun sets very late. Fortunately, they had not gone far too into the meadow before they turned back. They reached the edge of the meadow just about when the sun set, and there, they suddenly came upon the canyon that they had hiked down. It had been hidden from their view, or maybe it was not even there, while they were in the meadow. The river was flowing normally in the canyon, and it sank into the ground where it entered the meadow. When the group started up the river, they immediately recognized familiar landmarks, to their enormous relief. In that deep and heavily forested canyon, soon it was so dark that they could barely even see where they were going, even though it was still early afternoon according to their watches. With their one little pen light, they stumbled over the rocks, expecting to find the smooth trail that ran beside the river, but apparently, they missed a trail in the darkness. Rather than spend the night there, they decided to continue the short distance up the river to our camp. As they explained later, after having the canyon and the river disappear right out from under them, and becoming lost in the meadow, and having night come in the early afternoon, they were so shaken that they wanted to return to civilization right then. They no longer even were sure that our camp was still there, or even that morning would come, and they did not want to spend an eternity in a canyon that maybe went from one non-existent meadow to nowhere. So, they continued stumbling over the rocks, even after the little pen light's batteries were exhausted. Hiking on a smooth trail is easy in the daytime. Even hiking over rocks in the river is not too bad when you see where you are going. But it took them hours to go probably less than a mile up the river to our camp. Some of them were badly bruised from falling over the rocks, but fortunately, nobody was injured seriously. They were enormously relieved to reach our camp buildings and our camp's own little meadow. They headed straight for our group's campsite. I'd been out of the camp that afternoon. Otherwise, probably, I would have gone with them on that hike. When I returned to the camp that evening, the decision already had been made not to start searching for them until morning. The camp director already had telephoned to the Rotary Gospel Camp and had determined that our group had not been seen there. When they returned, I was almost as relieved as they were. We all stayed up late into the night with the camp director, going over their story. None of us found any significant discrepancies between their accounts. Their watches all indicated late afternoon. At first, they were not hungry. To them, it was not yet dinner time. Apparently, at least in that meadow, time had affected their environment at one rate and had affected both them and their watches much more slowly. Or maybe they still were too shaken to be hungry. Partway through the discussion, the camp director served them dinner, and we finished discussion as they ate. The next day, we had everybody who had been on the hike write their accounts on paper with no further prompting and with no discussion between them as they wrote. After they finished writing, we asked them to add their recollections of various details, again with no discussion as they wrote. I remember asking them to record details of the transition between the canyon and the meadow, and of the riverbed in the meadow, also about where the sun set over the ridges above the meadow. I do not remember now what details the other adults requested. That process went right through lunch, and they ate with one hand while writing with the other hand. No, we were not slave drivers. Those people seemed as anxious to record that incident as we were to have it recorded. Then, we turned the youth members loose, along with the two adults who had been on the hike, and the camp director and I stayed late into the evening comparing the written accounts. There too, we found no significant discrepancies. To the great regret of all of us, the people had been so shaken that the person with the camera had not thought to take the pictures of the meadow. Probably he still is kicking himself for that. Or maybe it is just as well that he did not take pictures. Just possibly, recording that scene might somehow have trapped them there permanently. Of course, that is pure speculation. Wild speculation at that. The following morning, the camp director, the two adults who had been on the hike, and I started down the river for another look. This time, we took maps and compasses, watches, cameras, flashlights with spare batteries and bulbs, and notepaper. I took a roll of brightly colored plastic tape for temporarily marking our route, both so that we could find our way back in case of difficulty, and, to be truthful, that just in case we did not return, other people could follow our route. On general principles, we took lunches. Portable two-way radios were not common in those days, otherwise, we would have wanted them. I took a small portable instrument for measuring the sun's elevation angle for any location and time of day. It is easier to compute the sun's azimuth and elevation angle. Also, if you measure the sun's elevation angle at two known and widely separated times during a day, then, in principle, you can compute your location, latitude and longitude. That is a standard procedure in celestial navigation. If we came to the meadow again, then I would compare the sun's azimuth with the magnetic compass and measure the sun's elevation angle at frequent intervals according to our watches. Then, back home, assuming that we survived the trip, I would try to make sense out of any strange behavior such as the group had observed 2 days previously. I also took a telephone in Linman's test set. That is a little self-contained telephone, like you see on Lyman's tool belts, except that test set had miniature rotary dials in those days, rather than modern push buttons. Our camp's telephone line ran beside the river to the Rotary Gospel Camp, where the telephone cable ended. Along the river between the two camps, our telephone line was attached to trees at about head height, so we could be able to use it in case of emergency. I admit to some concern that if we did find the meadow, then the telephone line might neither cross the meadow nor go around it, and thus we might be isolated. In our camp, I'd asked the hikers whether they had noticed whether the telephone line crossed the meadow, but none of them had noticed the line even in the canyon. As I look back on it now, we were asking for trouble. Maybe we should have had more backup before we started investigating. Before we left our camp, I found an excuse to telephone one of my friends at the Rotary Gospel Camp, and I arranged to meet him there. From our camp director's call 2 days previously, my friend already knew that something was wrong. I begged off explaining until we met personally. Now, after all that build-up, here comes the most embarrassing part of my story. We walked down the trail to the Rotary Gospel Camp and saw absolutely nothing unusual. On the way, I tied strips of surveyor's flagging to 3 branches at frequent intervals. I also kept a close watch on our telephone line beside the river. It was there, right where it was supposed to be. There was no meadow. The river still was very much there, in the bottom of the narrow canyon. The sun was rising slowly in the sky, just like it should be doing at that time of day. We went into the Rotary Gospel Camp, and we met our friends there. As my excuse for being there, I looked at some equipment that I had helped them to build, but probably they still are wondering why we went there that day. Our camp director used their telephone to call back to our camp to let our people know that we had made it safely that far. Then we took our leave and walked back up the trail to our camp, removing the strips of surveyor's flagging as we went. We ate our lunches in the camp dining room with the rest of the camp members. We felt relieved and also a little bit foolish. but we would rather feel foolish than be lost. These mountains have changed drastically during geologic time. The river systems have reformed so extensively that it is hard to imagine how much different they used to be. But all of that happened long before there were people on Earth. Thus, even if our group somehow was transferred back in time to another geological area, which I still find impossible to believe, that does not explain the log cabin in the meadow. What was that meadow all about? And the disappearing river? And the rapidly setting sun? Darned if I know. If that group made up their story, then they did have a very good job of doing it, telling it, and writing it with no significant discrepancies. If they used a hike as an excuse for some mysterious detour, then they had one heck of a climb out of the canyon to get there. I think that all of us were basically honest, except of course, for the standard campers' practice of telling outrageous lies around campfires. My guess is that the hitchhikers were just as puzzled as I was, and also were thankful to be alive after it was all over. That was a long time ago, and I've lost contact with all these people now. In January 2000, we lost my dad because of a doctor's error during surgery. As we were all very close to him, this all hit us particularly hard. I decided to move back with my mom. I was 24 at the time, and I took care of her. I've been with her ever since. It has now been nearly 7 years since his death. Before my dad died, I didn't believe in anything paranormal. I believed in what I learned at church, but I did not believe in ghosts or hauntings, even though I had experienced a few unexplicable things myself. I brushed them all off as weird phenomena, but nothing to concern myself with, and certainly nothing to change my views about, until spring 2005. When my dad passed away, we began having trouble with people messing around the house. There were a few things stolen from my dad's work building, and there were 3 batteries stolen right from the vehicles while Mom and I watched out a window after placing a frantic phone call to the police. The police didn't show up until some time later, and by then, the burglars were gone. Occurrences of this nature would happen time and time again. Spring 2005, I was up late one night, 1 a.m. or later, studying for finals in my bedroom. Everything was quiet and dark. The only light on in my house was in my bedroom. We lived in a very rural area, so when it gets dark and quiet, it really gets dark and quiet. I was engrossed in my studying when my dogs began barking. I sighed, realizing that someone was probably out there, but there was really nothing I could actually do about it since we lived so far away from a police station. They had already stolen most of everything of any value, and they never had tried to get in the house before, so I went back to studying. I'd become engrossed in my studying to the point that I didn't even really notice the dogs barking anymore, when suddenly, my bedroom filled with the overwhelming scent of my dad's cologne. But it wasn't just the smell of the cologne. You know how different perfumes and colognes smell different on different people because of differentiating body chemistries? Well, this was my dad wearing the cologne. I looked up, fully expecting to see him, but nothing was there. The scent was getting stronger and stronger. It was then that I noticed the urgent pitch of the dogs barking and growling, and the rustling coming from outside underneath my bedroom window. There was someone out there. Suddenly, Daddy's scent centered at the window beside the bed where I was working, and seemed to become malevolent. Don't ask me how I know this, I just do. It's like the air seemed to crackle. It was then that I heard someone running away breakneck from the house, without even bothering to try to be quiet. The atmosphere in the room suddenly went from malevolent to peaceful, and Daddy's scent lingered for a moment and then was gone. I'm not sure how I feel about it, but I can't deny it. I would like to think that he's still here, watching over those he loves. It made me feel very safe and taken care of. Not once did I feel one bit of fear over the scent in my room. Thanks for reading. I have yet another story to tell. I guess I am susceptible to spirits and apparitions, as I've had other encounters with loved ones who have passed. This one was my very first encounter. I was going through a very bitter divorce. Being only 28 and afraid to be alone with two very little boys, I didn't know which end was up, so to speak. It was in the summer. I had my two babies bathed and in bed. I decided to lay on the sofa and watch some television. I fell asleep, a pretty deep sleep at that. I was awoken by the static of the television. The station had gone off the air for the night. My baby of 10 months old had the bedroom right off of the living room. The sofa was facing his room, and he was sleeping soundly. I had a habit of keeping all of the bedroom doors open at night, so that if one of my sons cried, I would hear them. All of a sudden, the living room got so cold, like a very damp chill. A glowing light appeared at the doorway of my baby's room. Then a figure appeared, a woman, in a long white dress and dark hair. Her hair was up in an upsweep, but I couldn't make out her face. Her face was blurry, and I just couldn't see it at all. I was shocked, couldn't move, mind racing and heart pounding like crazy. I sat up on the sofa and just stared at this figure in the doorway of my baby's room. Then she spoke, only a few words, but she spoke. She said it will be all right. Then she vanished into thin air. That damp chill vanished along with the apparition. I was so shaken by this, not knowing who it was or what it was about. I eventually calmed down and put it out of my mind. A few days later, my mom and dad came up for a visit. They loved their grandbaby so much, they came to visit several times a week. We were sitting at the table in the kitchen, just chatting about anything and everything. That's when I thought of the strange happening I experienced a few nights before. I told my folks about what had happened and described the figure that I saw that night to my parents. I mentioned too how cold and damp it got in that room that night and how the chill went away when the figure went away. My dad sat there looking at me with the eyes of dinner plates and had a stunned look on his face. I asked him if he was okay. He said that he was, but he knew who that figure was. I asked him who that could have been, and he said it was his mother. He was only 7 when his mother died. She was only 34 years old. She died a week after her 9th child was born. She had all of her children in the farmhouse where her and my grandfather lived. Dad used to sit at his desk in a one-room schoolhouse and look out at her grave. The cemetery was right next door to the schoolhouse. I asked him how he knew it was his mother. He said the way I described her, wearing a long white dress, and the color and style of her hair. Her hair was dark and always in an upsweep, but this part is what really convinced me that he was right. He told me that she would always use that expression, "It will be alright," to him and his brothers and sisters when things didn't go quite right. He said he just knew it was her. He said she was comforting me and telling me that everything would get better. I was quite amazed, not only by the fact that I never saw my grandmother, but how she came to visit me in my times of need. I never had any other encounters with her after that visit, though I felt a calmness inside of me and felt somehow closer to her after that hot summer night. Thank you for reading my story. I hope you enjoyed reading it. I had visited my mother on Monday afternoon, after she and I had a disagreement on the Saturday before. She had called me on a Saturday afternoon and told me she needed to come to her house. I lived in the country at the time, and she lived about 10 miles from me. I'd just been in town with my youngest 2 sons for baseball practice. I also had just taken my only transportation to the shop to have new tires put on, so I had no vehicle to take me anywhere for the day. Our conversation escalated into an argument quickly, and I ended up hanging up the phone after she had not stopped her insistence that I come to her house immediately. She was never this insistent over me coming to pick up some fresh veggies she had gotten from her early garden. On Sunday, I was stubborn, and though I could have gone in to visit all day, I stayed at home. On Monday, I'd taken off work a little early to go to school to watch my sons in a spring sports day. I had about 45 minutes after the sports events before they would be out of school, and I went to see my mother. We talked, and our argument from Saturday was completely forgotten. She and I talked about all 3 of my sons. My oldest is 8 years older than my younger and 10 years older than my youngest, So he was in college and doing well. She told me that she had some problems with asthma lately, but she wasn't going to let it get the best of her. I told her she should really go to the doctor because asthma might not be something to ignore. She said she would be fine. On Tuesday morning, around 2 o'clock, I got a phone call that they were on their way to the hospital with her. I got up, dressed quickly, and drove into the hospital. About 20 blocks from the hospital, I was at a spotlight and thinking that I could run the light because I was the only car around, when I had a warm and comforting feeling fill me. Something told me to take it easy. She was okay and in heaven. Really, it was such a grateful feeling of peace. I got to the hospital, and I knew for sure the way the receptionist at the ER desk met me that she was gone. In the next week after the adjustments, I'd driven my sons to school and was on my way to work. There are some industrial sites at a cross street right before a spotlight, and it can get busy and bottled up. Also, there's a hill going down in the direction of where I was headed. I again felt a warm presence and felt her hand on my arm. Her voice said, "Vicky, look up." Far enough ahead of me was a tractor-trailer truck crossing over my lane into the side street. I'd been in deep thought about so much, but had plenty of time to slow down very preventively, not to have any problems with the truck. She has been with me many times since then, and it is always such a warm, loving feeling. In her life, she dismissed ghosts and paranormal things as if she didn't think it was real. I have no idea if she has ever been with any of my 4 sisters or my brother, but she has definitely been with me. Thanks for reading. When I was about 4 years old, I answered the front door. We had one of those bells that was a knob you would turn on the outside. There, in bright daylight, stood a woman dressed in all pale yellow, in a long dress and matching, colored big brimmed hat. This occurred in the 1950s, around 1959. I let her in. She asked for my mother. I told her I didn't know where she was. She was illuminated. I thought by the sunlight coming through the glass of the front windows and doorway. I was only about 4 years old. Not frightened by her, but rather I was fascinated and mesmerized. I followed her into our living room. She proceeded to sit on the antique Empire couch and kept asking where my mother was, and she seemed very concerned that I was left all by myself at a very young age. After what may have been an hour or so, she got up from the couch and said to me, "Tell your mother that Ada said it was very beautiful and don't be afraid." She then got up, walked to the front door with me following her, and left. When my mother came home, I told her about the lady in yellow named Ada and related her message. My mom almost fainted and fell down on the same spot where Ada sat. She asked me in a very unnerving voice, "Are you sure she said she was Ada?" To which I said yes. Then she said, "My cousin Ada just died a few days ago." At my age then, thankfully, I feared nothing. Ghosts were not in my brain tank, so to speak. Until about 7 years later, I was up in our attic. It was a very old house, looking for stuff to wear for Halloween, and came across the same dress Ada had worn when she showed up as a ghost many years before. It was a dress that had actually belonged to her from when she was young in the early 1900s. Also had a run-in when I was 19 years old. Old same house, with a sea captain. I was lying in my bed, daylight, and I was not asleep, just relaxing. Suddenly, I felt someone was there, next to me, and no one but me and my mom were home. My mom was downstairs watching TV. So, very reluctantly, I slowly looked to my left, and there, standing, was a tall man dressed in a blue uniform with brass buttons with anchors on them. He had no face, just like TV static for a face, but the rest of him was visible. He reached out a huge hand to me and said, "Don't be afraid. I only want to touch your blonde hair." It took me a while to not have a heart attack, until I found my voice. I screamed to my mom. She came running upstairs. I told her what happened, and she said, "You just had a bad dream." I explained to her I wasn't asleep. I knew what I saw, and I was very frightened. She then told me that my most male ancestors on her side of the family were sea captains, and some were lost at sea. She assured me that he didn't want to hurt me, but he almost killed me from fright. I've also had animal ghost visits, and those were of course sad, but that's a whole nother story. Didn't want to bore you. You may now go to sleep. Thanks for reading. I've decided after about a month or two of wandering around your site that I'll add my own story. I noticed your last update was in 2003 or so, therefore, I'm not expecting immediate posting of my tale. Keep in mind, this is the first time I've ever written the story out, so excuse me if I digress or repeat myself. In other stories that I've read, I've noticed people apologizing for extensive background information, so here's my apology/disclaimer. There's a serious pity me, I've had a hard life story involved that needs to be told before the actual ghost story can be understood. Feel free to skip over it, but don't expect to get the whole situation if you do. Oh, and may I add that I'm not completely looking for sympathy or anything, so that being said, here goes. When I was 14, I was living in a predominantly African American suburb in Illinois. My best friend and I seemed to be the only white teenagers around. Something started one night when someone called my friend's, let's call her Jen's, cell phone. The number showed up on Jen's caller ID as private number, and Jen answered, thinking it might be her parents calling from the restaurant they had gone to, but the other person on the other end started ranting about how Jen was a slutty person and a nasty whore. The caller proceeded to tell Jen that she should just kill herself and get it over with, adding that if Jen didn't commit suicide, the caller and her friends would hunt her down and slaughter her. Jen told the girl to grow up and hung up the phone. She was obviously and understandably shaken up, but she had the sense to star 69 to call. She wrote down the number and informed her parents of the incident when they returned. The next day, Jen's father, being the military man he is, called the number. No one picked up, so he and Jen headed to the police station. The police force in that town was also predominantly black, and when Jen stated that she thought the caller was black because of the way she spoke, the officer behind the desk gave her a dirty look and said he'd look into it and call her in the morning. She never heard from him. Then again, she never got another threatening phone call either. About a month later, Jen and I were walking back to our place from a convenience store about 9 o'clock at night when we heard something walking behind us. We turned around, and there was this black girl following us. We didn't recognize her from anywhere, and yet she started screaming the most obscene things I've ever heard, directed at Jen. To this day, and I'm 20 now, I've never heard such awful things come out of a human being's mouth before. This girl, who looked to be about our age, told Jen, "I told you to just kill yourself. I warned you that I'd get you if you didn't." She then stabbed my best friend in the stomach and chest. I was frozen with fear and shock, but I finally jumped on the girl and started punching her with such fury and animal rage that she backed off and ran, but in the scuffle, she slit my arm pretty badly and took off. I started to chase her, intending to tackle her to the ground, not knowing if I wanted to hold her down until someone came to help or if I wanted to just kill her for hurting my best friend. But I quickly decided that Jen needed me. So I went to Jen, ripped my t-shirt off, wrapped it tightly over her wounds, and told her to hang on. I ran back to the store we'd just left, in my bra, which made the most horrifying moment of my life also the most embarrassing, and begged to use the phone. I called the police and explained what had happened and where we were. Then I darted back to Jen, ignoring the blood dripping onto my jeans and the pain in my forearm. I sat there, with Jen's head in my lap, pressing the shirt against her injuries, telling her I loved her and everything would be okay, and that the police said they'd be there with the ambulance as soon as possible. It wasn't soon enough. Jen died in the ambulance. The stab wound to her chest punctured her left lung. She suffocated before even reaching the hospital. I didn't find out until the next morning. It was 2 summers later that I saw her. My family moved to New Jersey soon after the incident, thinking a change of scenery would help me forget. Wrong. Our new home was down the street from a conservation area where I liked to go and relax on nice days. There was one specific spot that I liked. There was a neat little clearing where just enough sunlight came through the thick trees, and there was a fallen tree that I'd sit on to read or write or whatever. On the other side of the clearing, though, there was a spot I wasn't too fond of. There were 6 saplings, taller than I, forming a triangle. I never had a positive vibe from that area. It just felt wrong, not like the rest of the clearing, where I felt peaceful and relaxed. If I walked through those trees, I'd have this overwhelming urge to burst out in tears and hurt something. I never knew why until one day. I was sitting on my tree, smoking a cigarette, and reading Shakespeare when that angry, depressing feeling came over me. The feeling I only got from that triangle of young trees. I ignored it and kept reading, but it grew and grew until I felt like I'd choke on it. So I looked up at the triangle and waited. For what? I had no idea. There was a little smoke coming up from the leaves on the ground, but I wrote that off as lit cigarettes someone had thrown. Then again, since I'd been there for quite a while and hadn't seen anyone around, how could someone have thrown a cigarette in there? So I shrugged it off and kept reading. Then I heard leaves rustling, and the feeling of deep depression intensified. There was no wind, the trees were not swaying, my hair wasn't blowing, but leaves were moving. I raised my head and saw only leaves being pressed into the ground, as if an invisible person were walking across them, and they were coming towards me. Needless to say, I booked it out of there and sprinted home. That night, I woke up unable to breathe, with a searing pain in my stomach. I turned the light on, and just as I did, I caught a glimpse of those familiar blue icy eyes I knew and loved. My best friend. After a few minutes, the stomach pain went away, and I caught my breath and turned the light only to see those eyes again and feel presence on my bed like someone sitting down. I felt like she was sitting there watching me, the corners turned up a little, and something cold touched my cheek. I realized then that the angry/depressed feeling I often got was flashing back to the emotions I had the night she was killed. Angry at the killer and myself, and so very depressed that the best friend I'd ever had was taken away from me. And the pains I had moments before were the same feeling she had when she was taking her last gasp of air. I suddenly felt overpoweringly tranquil. She was here, and she was not angry with me. "I miss you," I said, and went back to sleep. Nothing has happened since, and it's been 3 years. I think she's watching over me every day now, except I know it's her, not by a feeling of extreme sadness, but by the overwhelming urge to smile and make the most of my day. Thank you for reading. I know this was heavy-hearted, but I appreciate you sticking through to the end. Thank you so much. This happened to a friend of mine. She went to visit her mother's grave at the cemetery, and as she was leaving, she noticed the burial service was in progress. She saw a little boy of about 12 sitting by himself on a stone bench a small distance away watching the service, and she decided to join him. She described him as a very normal, happy young boy, dressed in a navy blue suit. The boy then started pointing out the people at the service, saying things like, "That's my mom, and there's my Uncle Ned." My friend assumed he was just at a family member's funeral, and was told to sit on the bench, as it might be too much for young children and nothing more. Then, the young boy stood up and said, "I have to go now. My mom needs me. Bye," and proceeded to the burial service. A little teary-eyed, she watched him walk down the small grassy hill when she lost sight of him. As she was leaving, she bumped into the funeral director who took care of her own mother's service. After chatting a while, the family that she had just seen were walking from the service. "How sad," she commented to him. "Very sad," he replied. "They lost a child to cancer." It was then my friend noticed that there were no children in the group, just adults. "Was he a little boy?" my friend asked. "Yes," said the funeral director. "He was only 12. She continued to watch as the members of the service walked by to see if she could find the boy she had just talked with, but again, saw no children. She is convinced the polite young happy man she spoke with was the ghost of the 12-year-old boy who was being laid to rest. But what stayed with her the most was the concerned look on his young face when he said, "I have to go now. My mom needs me." Thanks for reading. I know this is a creepy one, but I know you'd appreciate reading this. I recently attended the funeral and interment of my uncle, but first, I need to tell you about his father, my grandfather. Granddad was known as Mr. Beast around the city of San Francisco from the 1940s on. Dozens of people not known to the family came to his funeral because he had rescued them from a swarm trying to move into their house or in their house. Granddad died driving his pickup with a load of beehives on board, and the responders had to call in another beekeeper before they could get his body out of the crashed truck. Fast forward to July of 2009. Mr. B's son's casket is being lowered into the ground. 15 feet away, the white-gloved pallbearers have lined up in front of a large cypress tree. 30 feet across the lawn is the headstone of my grandparents. As taps is being played, I look over, and there's a mini swarm of bees harassing the pallbearers. Afterwards, the tree is checked for a hive, but the gathering of bees is over. That's all. Thanks. P.S. On July 27, 2009, I sent you an account of how a swarm of bees attended the funeral of my uncle, son of a famous bee man. On April 7, 2010, my mother, the bees man's daughter, died. The next afternoon, when I got out of my car at her house for the first time since her death, I heard that big buzz. Looking around, I saw the swarm just passing over the house. They didn't stay. The swarm at my uncle's funeral also moved on, but those are the only two swarms I've seen in my life. Go figure. Hi there. I'm a regular to this site. I love the stories. I heard the story from my grandmother before she died. It is true, I tell you, and I will tell you the way I heard it. Here it is. My grandmother and grandfather bought a house in 1942. It was a beautiful 2-story home and was about 60 years old at the time they purchased it. They have been only married 4 months and were very happy to finally have a house of their own. Before they lived with my grandfather's parents. When you walked in the front door, you have 2 big parlor rooms on your right and left and a nice-sized basement. My grandfather absolutely loved her new home and nothing could ever make her leave it. After they moved all of their furniture into it and got everything situated, they went to bed. About 3 a.m. in the morning, she was awoken by the sound of children running around in one of the parlors. She got up to see what was going on, and she did not see a thing, so she shrugged it off and went back to bed. The next morning, she was outside planting flowers, so was my grandfather, when a woman from down the street approached my grandmother and introduced herself. They talked for about an hour or so about the neighborhood and the town. The neighbor woman was about to excuse herself when she said quietly, "Do you know the history of your home?" My grandmother said no and was interested in finding out. The neighbor started telling her about the old funeral home that used to be ran here. My grandmother was startled to hear of this. Nevertheless, after the neighbor left, she went inside and looked around. She finally realized why the 2 parlors were so big. They were showing rooms for the deceased. This frightened her. My grandfather came in from the yard and sat down in the kitchen to have a nice cold cup of lemonade. As he sat and drank, he felt 2 small hands on his lower back. He turned around and no one was there. He immediately got up from his chair and ran to my grandmother. She was still in the parlor walking around and thinking. He said, "June, I felt 2 small hands on my lower back." She told him that the night before she heard the sound of children playing. Then she began to tell him about what the neighbor woman said about their home. He said, "Oh, Jane, I do not believe that. That is silly talk." Later that night after dinner, they were sitting in one of the parlors listening to the radio, when out of the corner of my grandmother's eyes, she saw a woman kneeling at the wall. My grandmother was speechless and very frightened about what she saw. So frightened it was like she was frozen. My grandfather looked over at her and said, "Honey, are you okay? What's wrong?" She mumbled, "Do you see the woman kneeling? Do you see her?" He said, "No, hon, I do not even see her." He started to get a little uneasy about his wife saying this. He said, "Jane, I think you need to lie down." So he took a hold of her hand and walked her upstairs to their room. She laid down and fell asleep almost instantly. My grandfather watched over her until he knew she was asleep. He walked down the stairs and into the parlor where the radio was on. He sat down and listened to the news broadcast. After about an hour, he became tired, so he thought he would go on to bed. He got up and turned off the radio and walked to the stairs. As he came out of the parlor, he was stopped by what he thought was the sound of a strong howling wind coming from out of the kitchen. The next thing he saw frightened him beyond belief. A pine ghostly casket with a woman inside rolled through the hallway and stopped in front of him. He let out a scream of terror that awoke my grandmother, which went to go see him. She saw him standing there in absolute shock. She called out to him in a panic, "George, what is wrong?" All he could say was, "I want out of this house. I want out." So they packed their things and went to stay with family about 10 miles away in the next town. They arrived at the family's house and told them about what had occurred. They looked puzzled and agreed to let them stay the night. The next day, my grandmother and grandfather and their family went back to their ghostly home. They picked up their things and moved out that very day. Sorry about the length, and sorry about the layout of the story. I bid you this the way I heard it. Hello, my name is Tana. I have a story that may or may not be ghost related, but it's strange, and to me and my family, it's something we will always laugh about. In October of 2001, my great-grandma died at the age of 94, peacefully, of natural causes. We all miss her greatly. At the funeral, I was in the separate section for all of us who were descended directly from her. There were a lot of us. Anyhow, this section had its own private bathroom, which had paper-thin walls and was the size of a coat closet. The service was rather boring and strange to me because of all the weird little Catholic chanting and such. The man conducting the funeral also had a very strange accent and kept making gross throat-clearing noises. Then the guy announced that my great-grandma loved to sing and dance, and that they would play her favorite song. The song started and it was opera style and in Italian. My great-grandma was born in Italy and moved to the US with her family at the age of 4. I guess I thought the music was a bit silly, and so did my cousins, because they all turned to look at me and my sister with smirks on their faces. This I did not think was really that funny, but just then, a balled up tissue that was on my lap rolled off of me and down to the floor where it rolled to a stop. This was so out of place that I instantly burst into loud, uncontrollable laughter in the middle of the funeral. I couldn't stop laughing, so with my hand over my mouth, I ran to the bathroom, a mere 5 feet away. I had to stay in the bathroom for the duration of my great-grandma's favorite song, which lasted about 5 to 7 minutes. The whole time I couldn't stop laughing, no matter how hard I tried. The only 2 seconds in place was my muffled laughter and a woman singing Italian opera. After the song ended, I was able to compose myself and leave the bathroom. I couldn't look at anyone because I was so embarrassed, and I was afraid that I would start laughing again if I looked into their questioning eyes. I just kept my head down and my eyes closed for the duration of the service. Now you probably think that I am the kind of person who just laughs like an idiot all the time. I assure you I am not. That was the first time I've ever laughed out of nowhere, or especially at a funeral. I haven't done it since. It could have just been that I was stressed out and upset about her death, or maybe that is how I cope with death. I really don't know for sure. I've come to believe that my great-grandma wanted to lighten the funeral up a bit by causing me to laugh, or that hearing her favorite song made her want to laugh with happiness, which I picked up on. There's no proof of this, but it made me feel so good to believe it. The whole situation was very strange and left me feeling funny but overall happy. This is long, so please bear with me. My grandfather passed away on Mother's Day of this year. He was 89. He had lived with my folks for the last year of his life and was a very stubborn man. One way of his to show control or whatever was to go to the bathroom in inappropriate places. Anyway, after his funeral, my family was sitting around the table talking. My 7-year-old daughter wanted to hear a scary story, so my dad came up with one about something scratching at a window, a cat. I leaned over to my mom and said that if he really wanted to scare her, he would have said it was great-grandpa at the window instead of a cat. Bad taste. Very bad taste. So everyone goes to sleep, and I'm the first to wake up in the morning. My 5-year-old son is sleeping out in the living room on a sleeping bag. There's a huge wet spot on it, and I thought he did it, but his jammies weren't wet. Odd, I thought. So all day I air dried the sleeping bag, and that night it was dry with a stain. I folded it, with the intention of taking it to a laundromat, and put it on the floor of my grandfather's bedroom, and went into the living room to tell my husband goodnight. I went back to the bedroom, and there was another big wet spot on the sleeping bag. I made myself take a deep breath. I looked up on the ceiling to make sure there wasn't a leak. None. I fairly calmly called for my husband to come down to the bedroom. He was rattled also, and then my folks came in to see what we were up to. We all sniffed it. What a funny picture that is. And it smelled like urine. They have no pets. My mom thought it was strange, but my dad had a lot of encounters of this sort of thing. He thought it was funny and said I should have made fun of Grandpa the night before. My lesson? Don't speak ill of the dead. Now I'm eternally scared because I keep thinking about the scene in Salem's Lot when the boy is floating outside the window and I picture my grandfather instead. Oh, about a month before he died, both my parents said they saw him walking down the hall with another man. They both sat there for a moment, then went in to check in on him. He was taking a nap. I'll post some of the things about my dad's experiences if anyone is interested, though I posted a few of those a few years back. Take care. Thanks for reading. I have another weird story about my experiences that I like to share. I was going to add it last time, but there wasn't enough room. It also happened to my mom. Maybe she is some kind of ghost magnet? It's the sort of thing you might need to read in a book, and it's not exactly paranormal. It's still pretty strange though. Once again, I cannot think that my mom would make up a story like this. It's so unusual to be made up. Okay, I'll get on with the story. One day, when I was small, in primary 1, first grade, kindergarten, I don't know what you Americans would call it, my mom was alone in the house, during the day, doing the dishes in the kitchen. We have no front garden, and our kitchen window looks directly onto the street. She suddenly saw coming down the street the most bizarre sight she had ever seen. A funeral procession marching down our street. A funeral car driving slowly, and a man dressed in black, wearing a top hat, walking in front of the car. When he got level with the kitchen window, he turned and smiled to her, tipping his hat slightly as if to say good morning. The procession continued down the street until it was out of sight. My mom's first thought was of panic. I'm going to die, she thought. This is a premonition. By the time I'd got home from school, she had stopped worrying and tried to forget about it. It doesn't seem very strange to see what my mom saw. Funerals happen every day. This one was weird for 3 reasons. Our street is in a maze of other streets. It is far from the main road, and driving down it is not a good shortcut, so why on earth would a funeral procession go down it? Why on earth would anyone, even someone who lived in our neighborhood, choose to take their last journey down my road? It's not old or very pretty. Nothing important has ever happened here. Even in broad daylight, it really is hard to see into our kitchen. It really is dark, which is why my mom was surprised that the man could see her. She couldn't understand why she was the only one he smiled at. There must have been other people in their houses. So there you go. Was it a ghostly possession from the past, a premonition from the future, or a real one of someone who really likes our neighborhood? Beats me. Well, this story actually happened to my younger brother a few years ago. I'm from New Zealand, from a town or suburb called Torbay, which is on the North Shore, which is basically North Auckland. This story I'm including is true, as it wasn't just him witnessing it, but a few of his friends as well, and they all claim they saw the same thing. I can't remember the exact date it happened, but it was during summer. It was a hot, humid day, and my brother and friend were so bored they went outside to play hacky sack. One of my brother's friends lives on a dead-end street, so they decided to play in the middle of the dead end, as it was just past midnight, and there were no cars around. Anyway, they were having a great game, when suddenly, they heard a roar of a motorcycle and felt a cold chill. They all stopped playing and looked to the top of the street. The sound of the motorcycle became louder, and suddenly, coming down the street at a fairly low speed, came a huge-ass black Harley. The biker was wearing full black leathers and a black helmet, and they couldn't make out his face. As the bike slowly came down the hill, going about 5 to 10k an hour, each streetlight he passed fluttered, then died out completely. My brother and friends were scared stiff and couldn't move. Each streetlight blinked out as the biker came down the street towards them, then circled around them in complete darkness, and slowly went back up the street. As he passed each streetlight, it would suddenly sputter back into life, each light blinking on again as the biker passed it. Then as he disappeared, my brother and his friends were left there freaking out at what they had just seen. Naturally, They all made a beeline for my brother's friend's house, and I don't think any of them got much sleep that night. So as far as I know, it is a true story told to me by my brother and backed up by his friends, who I've known for ages, and it's not something they will lie about. Pretty spooky, hey? Maybe Death has decided to keep up with the times and has himself a Harley now. Thank you for reading. Hey, I'm sending a few stories hoping one will make it. Let's put it this way. My house, the property around it, and my family's houses are haunted. When my sister was in the 6th grade, she had a huge sleepover. 5 of her friends came. They stayed up all night and ended up somehow on the roof of her playhouse. Well, her birthday is on the doorstep of fall, so scarecrows were up in the fields near our house. I never understood why. No one ever grew crops around us. They looked at one scarecrow, could have cared less, and turned around. 5 minutes later, they look, and it's closer. Now they don't know what to think, but they figure it's just their imaginations. But it keeps getting closer and closer and closer. They finally lose it and run back into the house. When I was 9, 1 year later, me and my friend were walking around on Halloween night. We see someone standing on the road. No big deal. We were the kind of kids who sword fought with sticks, so we wanted to see who it was. Big mistake. We get there, and it's a scarecrow, so I ran my sword through it. Well, I run off because my mom called me. When my friend ran to follow me, he started screaming Bloody Mary, which is weird because I'm the Catholic one. He runs ahead of me and beats me home. When I found out what happened, he swore, and still does, that the scarecrow spoke to him. I can remember a time when I came over for the night. We were having a great time until everyone but me went back to the house. I was just watching TV, minding my own business, when I took a glance outside and saw the scarecrow mysteriously close to the fence. The scarecrow was mostly up in the center of a field from the house. A few minutes later, I took another look, and it was back up about a mile away from the fence. Later, when my cousin came into the room, we both looked out, and the scarecrow was roughly 20 yards to the left than earlier. Thanks for reading. I know this might not be the most practical story, considering that scarecrows as spirits don't even make sense, but believe me, this was a true, authentic experience, and I'll never forget the way I felt when I saw this thing. I know paranormal stories are easy to debunk, but hear me out, because these experiences were authentic. I'm thinking that this could be a shape-shifting ghost of some sort. Has anyone ever heard of a demon transforming into a scarecrow apparition? As a kid, I always had great fears of scarecrows. If so, I'm sure this demon was playing games with us to frighten us. Thank you for reading once again, and I appreciate your readership. Well guys, Phantom is here, and he's back with a compilation, and some friends, some new stories by the end of the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I tried to do it in a different format this time because it was more interesting to me to do a compilation with a few more new reads. So basically, from the last hour or so, you got new reads that are completely from me. I don't want to make it sound like I read like an hour straight of videos. So the compilation was, the first 2 stories, the first group of, first 20 minutes, you know what I mean. You had the first 40 minutes or so of the reads that you probably heard if you're old to my channel and you've heard so many of my stories. But then I added on a new set of stories during the last 20 minutes, which means that you got new stories. Basically, a video that I could have done separately, but I put it into a compilation with the new reads. So, that's cool. I mean, I think that's a good idea. So comment, like, subscribe, and share this video because I put a lot of effort into it, extra effort. And I mean, I need recognition. I need it because I'm desperate, I need so much desperation because it's in my blood. That's the way I was raised. I was raised to be desperate, panhandling on the side of the street. Just kidding, guys. Anyway, comment, like, and subscribe, and sniffle like I've been doing because, I don't know, I have a stuffy nose right now, and I just can't bother acting non-stuffy. So I'll see you guys later. And remember, you forgot my shoes, so can you please give it back to me? You kind of stole it, and you said you would borrow it, but you never gave it back. So can I please have my shoes? I need them for the fall, and maybe winter because winter is about to be cold. So I'm scared, mommy.